Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. You've met Jeria a few times. She's the co-editor, and I'm Eileen Trauth, a professor emeritus at Penn State University College of Information Sciences and Technology. Um, we decided to have this virtual launch of our book, um, Handbook of Gender and Technology, Environment, Identity, Individual. The book was published last year, but the paperback version was just made available. So we decided to do this virtual launch in celebration of the paperback book being available. So the book you can now get is the hard copy, paperback, or an ebook. And there's a link in the chat to a URL to order the book. And there's also a link to the bios of the speakers. So in addition to Jeria and me, 8 of the authors who contributed to this book will be speaking today. Each of them will take 5 minutes to provide a high-level overview of her chapter. And then this will be followed by a Q&A session moderated by Jeria. Next slide. So I'd like to begin by providing a little background about this book project. This book is meant to be a single source for those interested in knowing more about the gender imbalance in science, technology, or STEM fields, and what can be done about it. Careful attention was paid to making the chapters accessible to a general audience who do not necessarily have specialized knowledge of science and technology or gender studies. For ease of reading, each chapter is presented in the same format: introduction, background, main part, and conclusion. This book is intended to support research, teaching, and general awareness about the topic of gender and technology, about state-of-the-art research, and about intervention strategies. The contributing authors are experts in their respective areas of gender and technology, and they represent countries around the world. Hence, this book offers a global perspective on the topic of gender and technology. Our goal in producing this book was to help advance gender equity in the STEM fields. So, underlying the chapters are some assumptions. First, a diverse technology labor force is good for both society and individuals to represent the varying needs of a diverse consumer base, to stimulate innovation through the diverse experiences and knowledge of developers, to provide economic opportunity to all through work in the growing information economy. Second, underrepresented people do not need to be fixed. They are not broken. Rather, the organizations in society need to be fixed. As you'll see in these presentations, gender barriers result from sociocultural factors, structural barriers, and varied individual responses. Finally, those of us in the social inclusion community also know that change doesn't just happen. This symposium will highlight research that can be used to inform interventions aimed at enhancing gender participation with technology, whether as users or as developers. The chapters in this book are organized into 3 sections, which are taken from the constructs of the individual differences theory of gender and IT that I developed: environmental influences, identity influences, individual influences. I would like to point out, however, that not all of the authors included in this book employ this theory. Some have done work that employs other theories about these influences. Next slide. My research and that of the others using this theory have documented that these 3 sets of influences can explain variation in technology participation. I have looked primarily at participation as developers of technology, but others have used the theory to examine users of technology. So I wrote 2 chapters in this book. In chapter 2, I present an explanation of the theory, its origin, and provide examples of its use in my research. While I began this research by conducting qualitative life history interviews with women working in the IT field, I also engaged in quantitative survey-based research. With respect to environmental influences, there are four contextual factors in society, institutions, and organizations which affect girls' and women's decision to enter and remain in the IT profession: organizational and societal culture, economy, societal infrastructure, and organizational and societal policy. With respect to identity influences, this set of factors refers to demographic characteristics that reveal the outside world's influence on the construction of self and the subsequent effect on participation in a technology career. In my research, I've considered gender, race, ethnicity, age, sexual identity, education, parenthood, disability, and socioeconomic status. With respect to individual influences, these factors represent the effect of significant people and experiences, along with personal characteristics that serve to inhibit or enhance engagement with technology. Examples of significant people are role models, mentors, and peers. Examples of personal characteristics are one's skills, interests, and abilities, and personal agency. In Chapter 10, I show how different identities, motherhood, race, and ethnicity, and sexual identity, result in varied exposure to, experience of, and response to gender barriers and biases. Next slide. This theory grew out of my investigation of barriers to women in STEM and how some women have overcome them. What I learned is that one size does not fit all. Women experience biases and barriers and overcome them differently based on personal and societal factors. Consequently, interventions need to take into account particular influences as well. The citation here is to a paper published in MIS Quarterly with my colleague Regina Connolly, and it shows how we extended this theory in a longitudinal study of women in the Irish IT sector by adding a dynamic dimension to it. So now we will turn to the other contributing authors. In the environment section, our first speaker is Monica Adea, Dean and Professor of Management, Rutgers School of Business, Camden, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey.
Morning, everyone, and thank you, Eileen and Jeria, for making this opportunity available. My co-author, Sangeeta, and I are grateful for this opportunity. Our chapter focuses on the retention or stickiness of Indian-born and native-born women in the US IT workforce. We interviewed about 30 women to uncover social, cultural, and economic factors that impact their career participation and retention. Three stories that I can share from our book chapter are women, Janine, Radhika, and Anita. First is Janine. She's a database administrator at a large healthcare organization. She faces a choice between accepting a supervisory role where she's unsure if she can gain respect in a male-dominated environment, or prefers to stay in her current position where keeping up with evolving technical skills has been a challenge for her. She feels conflicted but is hesitant to stay stagnant. Next is Radhika, a software engineer in her 40s. She's content with a technical role, but is being pushed towards a managerial role, which doesn't appeal to her. She's feeling isolated due to her age and gender. She struggles with the pressure to move up the corporate ladder. Despite this, her long-standing investment in her career discourages her from leaving. And then finally, we have Anita. After moving to the US, Anita trained in IT with her husband's encouragement and secured a job as a database developer. However, balancing her career with family responsibilities, especially after having 2 children, has led Anita and her husband to consider whether she should leave her job and focus on family. These stories highlight various degrees of career entrenchment, which is a financial, emotional, and psychological investment that individuals make in their careers. Entrenchment can encourage workforce retention, but if a job no longer satisfies the individual, it can lead to feelings of entrapment, or in some cases, even lead to career abandonment. In the chapter, we first explore factors that lead to differences in career entrenchment between Indian-born and US-born women in the US IT workforce. In India, parental and family influences play a strong role in steering children towards STEM careers. With the rapid growth in demand for IT services and the proliferation of engineering and technical colleges, IT jobs do offer high salaries, linear career paths, and social prestige. For women, particularly those seeking to challenge traditional homemaking roles, it provides an opportunity for quick social mobility. Additionally, IT careers are viewed as more family-friendly compared to other sectors. And as a result, women in India tend to make deep investments, financial, emotional, and social, in their IT careers, often shaped by familial expectations. In contrast, in the US, the belief that STEM careers are the sole path to socioeconomic prestige is less prevalent. With a more advanced and specialized economy, a wide range of career options exist outside of STEM. And IT, which is viewed as a gender segregated field, is often seen as limiting in its scope for women. Women in the US have access to non-technical careers that also offer similar flexibility and mobility, allowing for greater career fluidity. We then take the chapter to understand retention in IT careers, especially as it is cast in the context of career entrenchment. So we refer to Carson's model of career entrenchment in our chapter, which posits that over time, as individuals make financial, emotional, and psychological investments in their careers, their desire or ability to change career paths diminishes. Career entrenchment occurs when individuals perceive that their investments in their careers are high, but also believe that there are fewer career options for them. Entrenched individuals who are also satisfied with their jobs tend to remain career immobile, believing that they're in the right career. On the other hand, those who feel dissatisfied but see no viable alternative career experience feel that they're entrapped in their careers, which can eventually lead to career abandonment. And people who are less entrenched but dissatisfied are more likely to switch careers, while those that are less entrenched but satisfied, they tend to become voluntary careerists, which is they willingly stop exploring other options and are satisfied where they are. So our interviews revealed a few trends, especially with Indian immigrant women in the US IT workforce. They exhibit a stronger sense of career entrenchment due to early financial and social investments, as well as cultural values that emphasize STEM education and career stability. This contributes to their longer retention in IT careers, but it can also lead to feelings of entrapment if their roles become unfulfilling. US-born women, on the other hand, demonstrate greater career fluidity. Without the cultural pressures that Indian counterparts face, they're more open to leaving or changing careers when they encounter dissatisfaction or burnout. This flexibility can reduce the risk of entrapment, but it may also lead to lower overall retention in the IT workforce. So we think about the implications of our research that we presented for practitioners and HR managers, recognizing that career entrenchment is influenced by both cultural and individual factors can help them better develop support structures to promote positive retention and mitigate negative entrapment. We know about career flexibility, mentorship, skill development, investment in women, but understanding individual factors that lead to entrenchment, entrapment, or abandonment can help present a variety of options for women. And from a research perspective, this really opens up new avenues for exploring the intersection of gender, culture, and career dynamics in the IT workforce, especially around the different mechanisms that lead to entrenchment and their stickiness. It's also an opportunity, and Eileen Trauth and Connolly did a great job in starting that process, looking at longitudinal research to unravel the ways in which national contexts can shape individual gender dynamics in male industries like IT. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Monica. Our next speaker is Patience Apkan Obong, Professor of Integrative Sciences and Arts, Arizona State University.
Yep. Thank you. Hello, good morning. So the title of my chapter kind of speaks for itself, invisible but ubiquitous. So kind of took a general overview of different theories, policies, and early interactions of sorry, let me start that over again. So I looked at a historical overview of theories, policies that explain early interactions of women and technology in sub-Saharan Africa generally, with the case studies from Nigeria and Cameroon. And I started by explaining how in the past we looked at the issues from the perspective of access, and the fact that we looked at the digital gender digital divide, a case that a colleague and I addressed in a previous research. And so in the past, it was about access, that women in developing countries did not have access to the technologies. But this chapter shows that even when there were those barriers, and the barriers are still there, that in some ways, women in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically the women that that participated in this research, have over time figured out how to insert themselves into both the discourse and the practice of technology. And so part of the historical overview of theories included feminist theories and feminist theories of development generally, and then looking at also feminist theories of technology and women, and presenting the fact that some of these theories are framed in binaries. So women are considered as objects of development, or partners in development. They're also considered as agents of development or victims in development, which kind of complicates a clear understanding of how women interact with technologies, specifically, and the development process generally. And so with all of that, I argue in that chapter that it is not useful to look at the issues of gender and technology in terms of those binaries, because there's space in between where women have found themselves, at least the women in sub-Saharan Africa and those in the two countries that featured in this chapter. And to make the arguments about how women have created those spaces for themselves, I looked at the policies of both countries, that's Nigeria and Cameroon, and show how they mirror these uncertainties. Indeed, I started that chapter by looking at the commercial that one of the banks in Nigeria, actually the oldest bank, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa, the United Bank of Africa, and how over the years they have presented their advertisement. So it started by saying, you know, wise men bank with UBA, that's the bank. And with the assumption that only men banked, only men, I'm sorry, I had 3 hours of sleep, but I'll get it together shortly. My brain is still tracking. All right, so they started by saying wise men bank with UBA, and then over time, they started seeing that women also go to the bank. So they now came wise men bank with UBA and women too. And the way they did it, they kind of inserted and women too, right? So it was like women have always been an afterthought to development processes in some of these countries. And that commercial indicates that afterthoughtness of women in development. And so I kind of used that commercial as the frame to make to talk about how women in development continue to be afterthought, even now with so many women involved in the development process and in the gender and technology process as well. So the outcome of this afterthought about women is that and also the way the binaries that we have. So we look at women, either women in development, women and development, women for development. And so it's always about how women are either object of development or victims in development processes rather than active agents. And so I argue that looking at these perspectives from feminist and policy perspectives that frame the role of women in binaries unwittingly perpetrate the invisibility of women in the discourse, either the discourse of women and development generally, gender and development, or women for development, or women in technology, gender and technology, etc. And so I now kind of flip around to see, okay, with all of these binaries and the narratives and the afterthoughtfulness of women in the development process, what are women actually doing? Next slide, please. So the reality, as indicated in the research, is that women in these two countries and in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa have succeeded in creating spaces for themselves in the ICT sector. And so from the early days of working in cyber cafes, that was back in the 90s, in the late 90s, early 2000s, when mobile phones were not ubiquitous as they are today, and internet was barely accessed by people. So there were cyber cafes where people could go make phone calls or do internet, send email and all of that. So initially, women were the ones who worked there because they were just basically extension of the kind of office administrative jobs that women traditionally did, and the typewriting, secretarial kinds of jobs that women did. So that's how it started. And so you saw young women in these cyber cafes or as mobile payphone operators. Those were the women who sat by the roadside and provided phone services to people who came to make phone calls, basically retailing the phone services. And then that came up to, from there, they moved on to selling phone credits, phone cards. So people would go buy a card to activate their own phones. And so right from those early days, again, the late 90s, early 2000s, women figured out how to leverage ICTs to achieve personal economic goals. And over time, they have emerged as ICT educators, entrepreneurs, industry leaders, and created jobs and opportunities for other women. In the chapter, I looked at some of the women in those two countries and in sub-Saharan Africa generally, who are leaders in the ICT sectors of their countries or of their regions. So the chapter focuses on these contributions to showcase how women, circumscribed by the structures and institutions of patriarchy, customs and traditions in the environment have persisted in confronting and engaging with the system in progressive and empowering ways. So in other words, while patriarchy, like in many cases, women, at least in the early days, women who were online or who participated in social media were considered to be not good women, that they were out there looking for men and all of that. And so there was a lot of verbal violence against women who were online. I quoted in the chapter about a woman who said, no, she wasn't on Facebook because married women have no place on Facebook. But over time, in those two countries, a lot of women, especially young women, are doing a lot of innovative things online, like, they've become content creators, and they now have virtual marketplaces. And so they are leveraging those spaces to empower themselves economically and to some extent politically. And so I conclude that while masculine linguistic narratives, again, wise men bank with UBA and wise women too, the linguistic narrative that tends to exclude women from the development process, as well as the absence of gendered ICT statistics. I talk about that in the chapter, that the fact that in some of these countries, Nigeria and Cameroon, for instance, ICT statistics are not disaggregated in terms of gender. So one doesn't really know the degree to which women are participating in these processes. So that absence kind of perpetuates women's invisibility. And so there's a continued misperception that women do not do ICT. However, that chapter and a whole lot of the information there, which I'm not getting into at this point, I'm sure that women in Cameroon and Nigeria do indeed do ICT at all levels of society and complexity. And they're not just users, but they're also developers of the different aspects of ICT development. And developers and designers are not just those who build the devices, they're also those who found creative and innovative ways of using the devices in ways that further they advance their own economic and political goals. Thank you. Again, my apology. I came back late last night, had 3 hours of sleep, and it's still early here. So, but other than that, I think we did a good job with the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Patience. Our next speaker is Minna Salminen Carlson, Associate Professor Emerita, Center for Gender Research, Uppsala University, Sweden.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Eileen and Jeria. This chapter 5, is not about research. It is about an implementation project called FESTA, a 5-year project supported by the European Commission, with project partners in STEM universities or STEM faculties and a research institution in 7 different countries in Europe between 2012 2017. And what is both interesting and challenging in this kind of projects, there are a few every year, it is that the European countries are so vastly different. They have different university systems, different career paths, and also different levels of gender awareness. And that makes, of course, different levels and different kinds of resistance to gender equality measures. So in this project, with partners from all around Europe, we had some who were very new to the field and had what I call naive enthusiasm, believing that gender equality at their institution actually would be reached by a 5-year project. And then we had partners like us in Sweden, who had implemented gender measures for years and years. And of course, we were quite disillusioned about achieving notable changes by a project. So obviously, the new partners benefited from the old partners. We had lots of knowledge you could share, but also we old partners got inspired by the enthusiasm of the new partners. So we actually benefited from them. We noticed that where there had been little measures or no measures at all, the changes during the project and what the project achieved were much more notable. They could be different in different countries, in different universities, and not often in numbers. We had realized from the beginning that you really can't expect very much difference in numbers during a 5-year project. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon. But for example, even higher awareness of the gender equality problem and maybe succeeding in implementing 1 or 2 measures could be seen as an achievement because the work would continue, and it has continued in those universities after the project. But we were quite adamant in saying to the European Commission that don't expect us to improve the numbers of female professors with a 5-year project. Next slide. So what we did do? I'm proud to say that we were the first of these European Union projects who wanted to forward female STEM research careers, but did not address female researchers as such. We addressed what we call the working environment. And of course, we had all this research telling what issues are particularly problematic for female staff, but actually problematic for many men too. And that was kind of one of our arguments. Good working environment for women is good working environment for everybody. So one of the first tasks was to compile and present local gender statistics. Just as Patience said, there was no gender statistics in some of our partner universities. So, and of course, you can give a local actor numbers of research articles telling about the inequality in academia, but they don't believe the problem exists at their university until they get the local statistics. So that's what we did. We improved PhD supervision because we knew that more female than male PhDs leave the academy right after their PhD, largely because of their experiences during the PhD studies. So we helped female PhD students and also some male PhD students. We examined hiring processes, which was very interesting. In our very different institution, all universities had different processes. And it was interesting, especially as in 2012, when we started, that was still a relatively new area. Now there's lots of work being done on that area. Then we tried to improve 2 kinds of decision-making processes. So the first one, to find out how people actually get into powerful positions or to be in powerful committees, and to find ways to make those positions more accessible for female researchers. And of course, that also was different in our different institutions. So we had to find different ways of working with that. And secondly, our aim was to examine the informal processes, what we call meetings before meetings, or information flows that bypass women, and try to make those informal, invisible processes more transparent and in that way more accessible to women who are often the ones who are bypassed. We tried to improve meeting cultures by observation and training, and that was also a novelty among some partners, to make it easier for women, but also to some less assertive men to be heard. And then finally, we worked with the resistance. We knew from the beginning that we would meet resistance. And so we decided to make that a part of the project, sharing our stories, commenting on our stories, to make us better prepared to deal with the resistance we would meet and the resistance we met. So this is what you can read about in chapter 5. Unluckily, the Festa website with the address on the upper right-hand corner, it's not running anymore. The project ended to 2017, but some of our tools that we worked with are still accessible over the net. So there are links to them in the chapter. So thank you very much for the possibility to present my baby Festa to you.
Thanks, Minna. I think I'd just like to make an observation that I had said that in the book we have examples of both research and intervention. So the FESTA project, which I had the opportunity to be on the advisory board for, is a really good example of an intervention project that was carried out in Europe. So moving to the identity section of the book, our first speaker will be Manju Ahuja, Professor, School of Information Systems and Technology Management, University of New South Wales, Australia, and Fraser Family Professor of Computer Information Systems, currently on leave, College of Business, University of Louisville.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Jeria. Thank you for the book and for putting this together as well. I have to say, it's probably one of the pieces I've written that I've enjoyed more than most, and partly because I got to tell my story. So it wasn't like writing an academic paper, but more about just reflecting back on the journey and how things began and where they are now. And it was just a lot of fun to write. I think I shared that with Eileen. So I just want to make sure I say that publicly as well. So the story, I'll just basically go through a synopsis of that story in the 5 minutes that we have here. And the story begins actually in the second year of my PhD program, where I wrote something on gender and IT in a class project. And it just really carried me in a way that I thought I might do this for my dissertation. And I started talking to people about this, and the message that I received, interestingly, was that this wasn't going to be considered serious work. It was going to be considered, the message I was given is, well, you know, when you've done some serious work, then you can do this kind of fluff. So believe it or not, I actually took that advice and did exactly that. Not that I thought it was fluff, but it was serious enough, serious, very serious for me, really very personal. So after I did my dissertation work, published it in a couple of good outlets. After that, I thought, you know, now I'm going to do what I always said I would. So I dusted it off and started working on it. And boy, it must have gone through. This is a paper that eventually came out in Aegis. And it just laid out structural and social barriers for women in gender in IT careers. And it must have gone through almost every journal I could think of in our field, but also I think I sent it to AMR and MISQ and ISR and ISJ. It was just like, no, no, no. And I remember reviews that were just so telling. People said, is this really an issue in this day and age? And we are talking 90s. And I can say truthfully that it's still an issue in 2023. So yes, it was an issue then and it is an issue now. You know, my strategy has been in some ways that I study things that affect me personally. And this is something that affected me personally. And one of the factors that I talked about in this paper was a work-life conflict, a work-life balance. I was in my first job at Florida State, and we had an opportunity to look at a company that was in our board of advisors, and they, in one of the meetings, happened to mention that they had gone to the hoteling kind of a structure, and they were suddenly having all kinds of turnover. So people were being asked to travel to their clients and then go home when they were done on Fridays. And they said, well, maybe you can come out and talk to some people and see what might be going on. So with that, we did interviews, and eventually we did a survey and published that paper in the quarterly. Oops, I just lost my slide. And then essentially what we heard from people is that they had a lot of issues with work-life balance. They were gone, and they were away from kids, and they did that for a little while. But at some point they thought they just couldn't do it anymore. So they would quit. So that was essentially the paper in MISQ. So that sort of started this stream of research that I am still on, 25 years later. I had started working with Shani and Supratik Sarkar around that time on another project. And in fact, I want to kind of talk about that for just a minute as a aside that we met the Sarkars and I at the very first AIS conference in Pittsburgh, where I was a doctoral student and we had just met. So this year is the 30th anniversary of AIS. So just a shout out for that. So I'm remembering that in this moment. In any case, they approached me and said, hey, how would you like to apply for an NSF grant on this issue? And we want to study software developers. They had studied, they had done a case study on that themselves at a large corporation in Seattle. So we kind of put our heads together and got this NSF grant, and just looked at how global time zones and geographical dispersion, and that where if you are a software developer and you are in meetings across time zones, such as this one, and across geographical boundaries, how does it affect your work-life balance, and what national cultural issues that might bring up. So that was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work, a lot of money, NSF's money, not ours. But in the end, we really just had one paper that came out of it, and that was in ISR, and it was one of those papers that they just kept asking for more and more and more. And by the time it was done, we just didn't feel we had enough energy or data left to do anything else. So we basically put out a book which just had different aspects of it and different pieces that we had. There was one MISQ e-paper and then a few other things here and there. And then we also brought the initial work that kind of brought us on this journey together. So all that to say that kind of, as we were writing that book, it was by this time, it was already, the pandemic had hit, and the publisher said, well, we need a chapter on the pandemic because this is what everybody's facing now. So what can you do about that? So we added a chapter on that. And that was actually just a lot of fun. But it highlighted a lot of things for us, which we were already finding out, which is that job losses during the pandemic, 80% of them were by women. People were home without childcare and help and family help because we needed to isolate. So there was a lot of squeezing of tasks and time and so on. And a lot of those burdens were being carried out by women. So in a way, it was sort of reinforcing a lot of the stereotypes we have over time, but it sort of almost exacerbated those stereotypes and inequalities that we already face. So that was quite eye-opening for a lot of us. Media was talking about it. There were lots of papers in academic outlets that were talking about it. But we found in just writing about that and just looking at our own data, we found that a lot of the technology that was coming into the homes was actually creating a lot more issues for women than for men. So thinking about when both partners work from home, who was giving up their offices, who was working in the kitchen, who was helping kids do their homework while cooking and taking their own calls. And so all of those things really became quite glaring at that time. So on one hand, we were showing that ICTs were really wonderful for getting the work done during the pandemic. But they were really causing a lot of issues for women. And so now I've actually been taking this work into the work from home arena because it's still going on in a variety of ways, in different forms, but still the issues are fairly similar. So one study that we have going on right now is where we actually look at partner dynamics. What happens to partner dynamics when both are working from home? So there are issues like we know, and I'm also looking at attentional capacities and multitasking, what it does to us. So basically, that is an explanation for whatever is happening in this, all the stuff that I've been talking about so far, which is that we have limited capacity cognitively. All of us do. We have limited resources. But when we have multiple demands on our time and our cognitive resources, it is exhausting, for one, but also it takes down our regulatory capabilities. So there's the theory of family undermining or partner undermining behaviors. So we get impatient, we get critical, we get just, we make snippy comments. And so we are looking at some of that as a result of what happens when technology comes inside your home during your personal time, which is what happens when we are working from home. So we don't start at 9, we don't finish at 5. Not that we have done that for quite a while, but when you're working from home, that it's that much more, that effect is quite highlighted. And again, we are showing that men's productivity goes up and women's productivity goes down. Although we are seeing some efficiency effects, women become more efficient in getting things done, but in terms of creativity and outcomes that require that cognitive and creative abilities, that goes down. So that's work that's going on now, and actually it's been quite enlightening, and we'll continue to do that. So we're doing this work mostly in diary studies, generally 10-day diary studies, 3 times a week, kind of experiential data collection. So I present all that to really point out that that we really need to study these things more deeply. And work-life conflict has been looked at in one way, but Ellen Kosek, for example, has been doing some phenomenal work in this area. And one quote I put here on the slide, I absolutely love, that we just really, this needs to be, and I've lost my slide here, so I can't quite read it, but it's in front of you there. But the idea is that work-life inclusion should be a part of the inclusive climate that corporations talk about, because unless we address these issues, we lose women, we'll continue to lose them, and they'll have productivity issues, we'll have labor force issues in general, how many people are entering and of what caliber, because we want high caliber women to enter IT fields. And especially as work from home and hybrid work, etc., continues, unless we address this issue in great depth and also affect the organizational policies and practices, it will not get better. So I'm inviting all of us to really look at this seriously and deeply. Thank you.
Thank you, Manju. I noticed in the participant list, there are some people who are not from the information systems field. So when Manju was mentioning some of the publications, I want to point out that they're in the bibliography of your chapter, so people can see the references that she was talking about. Our next speaker is Eleanor Locano, professor of business analytics, College of William and Mary in the United States.
Great. Well, thank you, Eileen and Jeria, for doing this. I think this is great, and it was really a great chapter to work on. I worked on it with my colleague Xia Chow from Smith College, and I have to say, from what Manju was saying, I got some of the similar things with working on looking at gender and stuff in the beginning, where in my dissertation, I was told when I wanted to do a study on gender, well, you know, so-and-so already did that. So there was one paper on it, so we were done, right? So I do believe that this is definitely where work needs to be done. But the chapter 14, what I'm focusing on, and what we focused on, is really something near and dear to my heart in looking at disability, but also looking at gender, and looking at the intersectionality. So gender, disability, and race and its impact on IT accommodations and employment. So I tried to keep it pretty simple. I'm not going to read the quote that's there, but just kind of starting out with what we found. So you kind of get that takeaway very quickly, is that the intersectionality matters. Kind of these, you know, the title is The Chains That Bind, right? And so we have the double bind, and we see as we kind of add that for gender, and that as we add disability or race, that kind of adds to the issues that people are dealing with. And in particular, Monica, it's a pseudonym for one of our participants, said, you know, she always is going into the situation realizing that she's a woman of color and with a disability, right? And this became so overwhelming because she felt, again, with that having the disability and looking at her, you know, having to deal with going into that and always feeling like she had to explain herself or say, oh, I can use my own computer and stuff like that, that actually she went to a therapist to try and help figure out some of the ways to help her in these situations. And I think that's a great explanation of kind of what happens, is that we put so much pressure as these binds kind of clink together, that we have impacts like this that people struggle with. And I can talk to COVID in a question if anybody has a question on that, because there were some interesting things that related to COVID and how people with disabilities had been pushing for work from home and that, and it didn't happen until COVID. So there was some positive benefits. But if we can go to the next slide, I'll kind of talk about kind of what inspired us, or what's the background of why this is so important. And the background really is that people who have a disability are very much underemployed, have a employment rate of about 19% compared to those without disabilities, which are about 66%. And they're just, you know, people with disabilities want to be employed just like all of us. They want to be productive. They want to have a job. It's part, you know, it's what they need. And also there's this idea of ableism within society. It gets back at what Eileen had said about underrepresented groups don't need to be fixed, right? Oftentimes we look at people with disabilities as they are lacking. And this idea of ableism in society kind of takes from the medical model that people who have a disability are impaired. They are less than. And all the research, you know, that I've been doing, and if you look at the research, that there's a different way of looking at that. And I'm so happy with social inclusion that they've opened up kind of looking at this social model as opposed to the medical model, which really looks at it being something that society needs to look at, right? Society needs to figure out how to include people and not look at their disability as something that is less than, but that they need to figure out how to better include, if that makes sense. And I also talked a little bit about the double bind and with gender, and then kind of adding disability and race to that it becomes more and more. And so you do see with people who have a disability that they make less, right? So women tend to make less than men, women who have a disability make less than women who don't have a disability and men who don't have a disability. And so it just kind of adds on to the pressure. And so what we wanted to do and where we kind of came up with how these fit together is we did interviews with people, individuals who are disabled, and we use a identity first. With this, I'll just point out, some people say people with disabilities. There's also a camp that says put disabled first. So that is why we chose this. We're going with that terminology. But we did interviews of people who had disabilities who were working in their workplace in IT and were looking for accommodations. And we used the individual difference theory of gender model that Eileen had come up with, because we felt it was a really good structure to look at their situations, right? So we could look at the individual identity, the gender, the disability, race, and look at that intersectionality. And we could also look at the individual influences. So we, heard from people, they had different abilities or agency in terms of understanding their disability and also advocating for themselves, right? So the ability to be able to do that, their past experiences with disclosing their disability. So some people, if they have a learning disability, may not, it's not very, you can't physically see it oftentimes. So people, they have to actually disclose it. And that could come with, people being very accepting or people not being accepting. And then the people, other people in their life, like the supervisors, how did the supervisors react to them needing accommodations, right? And so we looked at it from that, and the environment being the IT accommodation itself. And I'm not doing justice because we only have 5 minutes to go through this, Eileen, so I apologize. But the idea here is we wanted to see what they encountered and how things were, how they handled things, and how did the identity and how did the individual influence impact this, and they're getting IT accommodations. And it was really, I put Monica's quote up there because I think that's really what you see from a lot of people, is this frustration and issues of kind of how do you deal with this as you layer on these complications for being a woman, maybe of color, and then you add on a disability, and it really kind of weighs them down. And so I'll jump to kind of what our recommendations were. You can go to the chapter and kind of hear more about what individuals said, and we did have some men who were included in the data. But one of the things that we suggest, and we think that it's something that's very important, is that having a special fund in companies is oftentimes very helpful, because when you have a supervisor who has a limited amount of funds to give to people who need accommodations, and I guess I should step back real quick and just say an accommodation could be anything from a screen reader, if somebody has issues with blindness, a productivity tool to be able to schedule things out, things like that, for somebody with a learning disability. And so it's these accommodations oftentimes cost money. And so being able to have the money be able to be taken from a special fund as opposed to something that is taken away from the supervisor is often very helpful, because it makes the supervisor tend to be more work more with the individual. And finally, training for supervisors and coworkers. I think one of the biggest things that we've seen is that supervisors and coworkers oftentimes feel uncomfortable if they haven't been around people with disabilities. And so there's oftentimes they worry about the questions they can ask. They want to be able to ask stupid questions, but are afraid to. And so being able to have this training is very helpful. So I know we're under time, so if there's questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I do think that looking at intersectionality, it's not just even gender anymore, but as the individual difference theory of gender and IT point out, there's many different ways of layers that we can look at as we move forward in this research.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you.
Now moving into the individual part of the book, our next speaker is Florence Chi, Associate Professor of Digital Communication and Director, Center for Digital Ethics and Policy, and the Social and Active Media Lab, School of Communication, Loyola University of Chicago.
Thank you, Eileen and Jeria, for putting on this amazing event where we're coming together and we're able to, as authors, lend some context to our chapters in this edited volume. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank my co-authors as well, Todd Somella, Bettina Berendt, and Jeffrey Martin Rockwell for their contributions and essential work to put this chapter forward. Our original journal article received kudos from the American Library Association, and this was very important to us because we talk about especially the way that data and data archiving has been handled and how we don't really talk enough about the act of curation and often the way we encounter ethics, as in our chapter, Applying Feminist Ethics of Care in Conducting Internet-Based Archival Gender Research, the case of studying Gamergate reactions, whether in educational or corporate settings, is often an afterthought. In this chapter, we argue that applying ethics of care, especially a feminist ethics of care, is a crucial intervention that should start from the beginning, from concept through to execution and after the fact, how we can prioritize relationships in a way that acknowledges power differentials specifically. And in tech, we often talk about what we can do, but ethics gives us a chance to talk about what we should do. And the chapter focuses on ethical challenges encountered while working on the difficult topic of Gamergate. Some of you may be familiar with this, and I'll just do a little elaboration throughout this presentation. We don't present an analysis of the Gamergate phenomenon here because that's very exhausting and it's been 10 years since then. But what Gamergate showed us was that its related web content provides a challenging example of dealing with the ethics in digital humanities as it relates to gender and the artifacts arising from that controversy, such as web archives, the Twitter streams of then, are closer to the data sets dealt with by social scientists than the painstaking preserved codices of libraries, traditional archives, or the bound volumes of a magazine, say. As digital humanists, including gender scholars, we need to engage with the discourse on ethics arising from other disciplines, especially STEM. The humanities are gradually coming around to devising ethical guidelines, especially in the last few years, around contemporary content that is publicly accessible on social media and online forums that, we largely lag compared to those who work with archives and libraries and museums and what they've been accustomed to doing. The lessons learned from our experience can and should be applied to other digital humanities projects. So next slide, please. One purpose of our chapter is to describe the research that we did as it evolved in ethical reflection throughout the entire project life cycle. The initial research project was based on Gamergate reactions to this misogynistic movement online. And our project Gamergate Reactions examined the conflict from its emergence 10 years ago. And it erupted in the summer of 2014 and became a flashpoint on how online game communities thought of themselves, quickly engulfing the gaming community in a legitimacy crisis and intense debate about who and what belonged in gaming. Right. And the conflict gradually escalated into another battlefront in the culture wars involving gender identity and political beliefs. And often games do, in the controversies therein, predict what the controversies of mainstream media will end up being 2 years later. And so this kind of tracks with 2014 being Gamergate and the rise of the alt-right being in 2016 largely. Overt harassment of women and others who were critical of aspects of gaming culture quickly became a dominant feature of online forums. And so Twitter, other media in which discussion around gaming culture occurred, rape and death threats were sent to prominent game developers about and journalists, some of whom were also doxxed, had personally identifiable information such as their home addresses disseminated online. And this harassment and other extreme expressions of hatred and intolerance quickly eclipsed the alleged ethical issues in gamer culture that were supposedly for Gamergate. Next slide, please. From the Gamergate reactions, could we go before the previous slide, please, Jeria? We extracted data from a scrape of Gamergate tweets, and we kept that, but we decided ultimately to delete the 4chan data. But we knew that 4chan data was a major communication channel for Gamergate, and the importance of archiving that data started to dwindle, and there were diminishing returns on that. And the thought of preserving further the 4chan data, including pornography, harassment, doxing, and other noxious behavior, when it came time to decide what we had collected from 4chan, the research team faced a complicated decision to continue exposing themselves to that kind of toxic data, or expunge it from a publicly funded, curated data set. Was a pretty fraught discussion. But it ran opposite to the ethics of care approach we were trying to honor throughout the research process. So if we could advance the slide at this point, thank you. Our priority was to underline the contextual nature of ethical decision-making. And given that our research group was comprised of postdocs, graduate students, professors, and the bulk of data analysis was performed by those with less comparative institutional power, was it fair to ask them to review potentially offensive material in order to make a marginally more forceful case that Gamergate was indeed containing misogynists and rape threats? We already had evidence for those behaviors in the social media data and the web pages that had been collected, and the small size of the 4chan and 8chan data we'd collected in comparison to the large numbers of tweets led us to the conclusion that additional analysis of that material probably wouldn't change much significantly. So we decided to delete it because of concerns that came from the community that was largely under fire during the Gamergate era. And so, one might say that trying to provide guidance based on potential outcomes is the core of our ethical argument. And so hopefully that provides some context for how the ethics of care came to feature so prominently in our analysis of Gamergate. And we thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Florence. And now we have Marie Bush, Associate Dean, College of Business and Professor, Management Information Systems, Michigan Technological University.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to share my research with all of you, and we appreciate all the attendees. So my chapter is chapter 19. The purpose of this chapter is to present an innovative technique called job crafting. And it's to help develop and retain diversity in the IT workforce. So it's a positive intervention similar to some of the others that you've heard today. So we're looking at modifying jobs, and it's initiated by the worker instead of by the manager. So there are some instructions, some techniques presented in the chapter, and it goes back to the foundations of positive psychology. And one of the most familiar theories probably is flow theory by Csikszentmihalyi. So we're looking at how do we develop tasks, relationships, and purpose or perceptions. So all of these come together to enhance your work engagement, and that's really the goal. So too often mentoring is a top-down approach, and this is really a bottom-up or a peer-to-peer even. And you can do this for yourself as well. If you find yourself a little bit stagnant in your job, you might use this technique to help enhance. So again, the goal is to enhance that work relationship between yourself and your goals in work. The next slide is going to be an illustration, but let me just finish here with limitations. Mostly it's anecdotal, so the future research is going to be on more rigorous or experimental type research. It will also enhance some of the other ways that we can use job crafting in different industries as well. And then in conclusion, I'm going to say that you can always contact me if you want to do some work on this with me in the future. So the next slide, this is really how the technique is employed. We start out with a before sketch. So it can be from your job description. It can be related to how you feel or perceive that you're spending your time at work. This was really from one of my pre-graduate degree positions that I had. So most of the work was more clerical, very dry, order processing. What I wanted to do was more managerial, working with people, more engagement, even managing a little bit. So this is how I would have outlined or imagined how I was spending my time. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing the after sketch. So ideally, how would I have enhanced my job? A lot of us, if we're really engaged and we treat our jobs more as careers or callings, we just naturally enhance what we do in the workplace. So if I went from, in my case, I went from probably a one-page job description with room left over to, by the time I left, I had single-spaced like 6 pages of things that I've taken on myself that were enhancing the job naturally. Now, not everyone does this for themselves. No, not everyone has that initiative. So this technique would help individuals to, working with them proactively to help them see opportunities that would enliven, engage, refresh the individual's engagement with their job. So this is just a simple example. The chapter goes into more detail about theoretical foundations, different ways to use this technique. So it's similar to some of the other presenters today. We encourage you to go to the book chapter and dig in more deeply. So I'm going to keep it very short today, but if you have questions, please do contact me.
Thanks a lot, Marie. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this over to my co-author, Jeria Quesenberry, who's going to talk about her chapter, and then she's going to segue into the Q&A session of this symposium. Jeria?
Thank you, Eileen. I want to keep this really brief in the interest of time so that we can engage in a discussion together. But in the handbook, I authored a chapter number 21, that highlights some individual influences that we've seen at Carnegie Mellon University. CMU is a success story. It's a place where we have reached and sustained gender parity in the undergraduate programs, both in computer science and information systems. So in this chapter, I explore a variety of individual influences and do so in a longitudinal manner, looking at case study data from the late 1990s all the way to about 5 years ago. I'll just say kind of at a high level, and happy to talk more about this offline or in another forum, is that the case studies have really demonstrated that women represent a wide spectrum of attitudes and responses to individual influences. And it's really, really important to stress and echo what many of the other authors have shared here today, that women are not a monolithic, one type of person, that there is a significant amount of variation and spectrums of ideas and attitudes. I do want to leave a lot of time for discussion, or at least the time that we have left here today. So if I could just briefly try to summarize a few closing comments on the handbook itself. We hope that the discussion has demonstrated that the challenges and the obstacles that remain when it comes to gender issues in the computing field are very broad and very, very vast. But there are opportunities as well. A second thread that has cut through the micro talks that you've heard today is that evidence-based interventions can be a pathway to overcoming many and some of these challenges. As Eileen opened up our discussion, the handbook is grouped into these 3 sections. The environmental influence section contains much of what you've heard already, but also several additional chapters on other cultural contexts like Australia and Asia. The second portion of the book focuses on the identity influences. In addition to what we've heard today, there is special focus on minoritized technology workers. Also, some of the trailblazing that's been done in the LGBTQA+ communities. And then finally, the last section of the book on those individual influences goes quite a bit deeper in the importance of role models and mentors, a number of interventions surrounding those areas. And then finally, thinking about self-efficacy and coping mechanisms. I will put a link in our chat again in just a moment that will take you to the bios of all of the authors that you've heard from today. There's also a link to our publisher's website, which has more information about the handbook to include a list of all of the chapters and all of our authors. The publisher has also offered a 1 week long, short discount code. If anyone is interested in purchasing the paperback version of the book, you can do so in the next week with a 35% discount on that work. So I'd like to kind of pause here and just say thank you to all the authors in the handbook, and in particular, thank you for those who were able to participate in this webinar. For the attendees who are here, we do have a Q&A feature as a part of the Zoom where you can enter any questions or comments. It's viewable by myself and all the panelists. I will pull out a few of those questions in our remaining minutes that I can pose to the group, but please do feel free to utilize that Q&A function for our remaining time. Going forward, we have recorded the webinar, and we will make the video link available to anyone who is interested in viewing again or sharing with colleagues. Please do just reach out to myself or Eileen, and we can share that video link with you. And then, of course, I speak for the authors and our panelists here today. This really is just the beginning of a continued conversation. So please do reach out on email or follow up with us as a group or individually to discuss more. So we have about 6 minutes, which obviously is not nearly enough time to really engage in a deep discussion. We've had a couple questions submitted in advance. Eileen, I saw you raised your hand. Did you want to say something before I pose?
Yeah, I did. I didn't know if this would be a hard cut at 10:30. Will it be, or would be able to go a few minutes longer if there's more questions?
I think it's a hard cut at 10:30,
Okay.
but if there are people who want to stay on, we could maybe initiate another Zoom if this one terminates. Andrew, are you there from Media Services? Will the webinar do a hard end at 10:30?
No, there's no hard end on that.
Okay. Okay, so we'll officially kind of end the webinar in 5 minutes, and I'll give anyone who needs to exit, the opportunity to do so. But for those panelists, including Eileen and I, who want to stay back, we can do that a little bit past. Okay.
All right. I had a question that was sent to me in advance of the of this webinar.
Okay, perfect. Do you want to start out with that one then?
Yeah.
Eileen?
Okay, so I think this is an interesting question about cultural differences, and it has to do with how do you reconcile, American norms and behaviors, or any countries. In this case, it's American norms and behaviors regarding gender or other minorities, with the cultural norms and behavior from another country. And so, for example, cultures where men do not shake a woman's hand. Uh, Perhaps avoiding someone who is an LGBTQ individual. So I think this is an interesting question. And I don't know if Jeria, if you had an answer, or if you had, because you have spent time in some other cultures, I don't know if you had thoughts, or some of the other panelists.
Well, I would love to hear from the other panelists, but I will just add briefly that I think the idea of cultural intelligence is really important. Being able to physically, intellectually, and emotionally read the cultural context for which one is in, and use that as a means of informing behavior. But I would love to pose that to any of the panelists who have also, I mean, we have many joining from around the world today who could maybe speak to cultural differences in more detail. Patience.
Well, thank you, Jerry, as somebody who navigates across cultures and etc. So that's really important, because sometimes those of us from the West going to the developing countries, there's a tendency to assume, like Eileen said, that everybody needs fixing, everything needs fixing. My research, and part of it shows in the chapter, is that sometimes nobody needs fixing, but what needs to kind of see what is already going on, and then figure out the spaces where we can interact in a positive way. When it comes to shaking of hands, I remember when I was working on a book, going to somebody's office in Abuja, Nigeria, a policymaker, and I walked in with my Western suit and my briefcase, like the graphic that one of the speakers showed, all confident. And I walked in, I said, "Good morning, sir. Good to see you." And the guy just, yeah. And it was like, earth open up and swallow me. And so it's necessary to just understand them. And just some of those cultural things, and the handshake, that's just one of it. Actually, it's a minor one, that bigger ones, like interacting with men in different cultures, or even with women, and making assumptions about what you think they believe or how they should act. And so for me, it's, again, I was born somewhere else, I live somewhere else, and it's just understanding what the cultural ethos are and trying to navigate through all of that without being condescending or acting as if what happens there is inferior to your own belief systems.
Yeah,
So can
Eleanor,
I jump in real quick? Oh, sorry. So one of the things I want to say is what's interesting, because I do work like a lot on the disability side, is that, there's a lot of kind of this idea of social emotional awareness. And so I think oftentimes it's not even going out to another culture, but just having people who might be on the autism spectrum, or people who have, who are anxious, OCD, things like that. I mean, I think the thing that is becoming more and more is to kind of look at accepting diversity, right? And when you get into an environment, not expecting that it necessarily has to be in a particular way, but kind of like you had said, Jeria, reading the room to see what's acceptable and not making people feel that it has to be the one way, if that makes sense.
yeah, thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Patience. If I could just ask one last question before we sort of informally end the webinar. We have a question that was provided from an attendee who has been working on a dissertation exploring parental perspectives on career decision-making in South Africa. She mentions, Eileen specifically, that you've had a positive influence on her work. She raised a couple questions. One that I'd like to ask our authors is, what strategies do you recommend for enhancing the inclusion of women in executive roles within organizations? And maybe that's perhaps a little too broad for the group of Eileen.
Just like to make an observation. Some countries have quotas. The United States doesn't, but in Europe there is the 30% rule that some countries like Germany have. And I think that's one way to get us up to a critical mass. But the danger is if there's kind of a cherry picking and simply putting people in positions for the sake of numbers. And I think that can have a backlash. So it's just an observation about efforts that are, to my mind, it would be working the way up. So working through the pipeline would be an important way to do that.
Excellent. Manju, did you have your hand up or no? Okay. We are right at time, and I know some of our authors have other commitments that they need to run to. So I'd like to do kind of a soft end here and thank everyone for attending, and thank you especially to our authors for the work that you're doing, the important work that you're doing, and for sharing some of your experiences and insights with the group today. We greatly appreciate it. So please do leave if you have other commitments. Eileen and I will hang back for those who would like to continue the conversation. But again, thank you so much for your time today.
I'm gonna run. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.
Hi, Manju. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I can stay for a few minutes longer
Okay,
if
wonderful.
there's need.
Eileen and I are here. Monica's here. Patience is here. Since Eileen and I, wonderful. We still have a few attendees in the room as well. If you would like to pose any questions to the Q&A, we can take a look at those. I do see that we had one other question that came through, talking a little bit about the phenomenon, the glass cliff, that focuses on early stages in women's career. And the attendee is asking about how leadership in the IT industry could be different or unique. I think this is in reference to different career stages, early versus later.
I would like to hear the answer to that question. I'm working on a book on gender leadership and the IT sector in sub-Saharan Africa. So I would like to hear the answer to that question.
Well, I'll make offer some thoughts. There's probably something in human evolution that has to do with being attracted to people who are similar, that might go back to our, survival. And I think maybe the nature of bias and barriers has shifted a little bit so that it's maybe more subtle. And I think there can be many times a discomfort being around people who are different, people whose skin is a different color, people's sexuality is different, people's gender is different. And so I think it's, some of this, and so if a person who represents difference in some way encounters a majority group who has discomfort, so maybe they're not doing any kind of overt harassment or something, but there's a discomfort level with being, around that person who is different. And I think some of this goes back to, structural issues of training. And Minna talked about it in her presentation. So, finding opportunities to provide education and awareness to the majority about a minority, but not always putting the burden on the person who is the minority to be the one to have to explain, okay, my culture is different. We do things different. I have different experiences. So I think some of this is a structural thing that has to do with opportunities to create awareness and education, and not leaving it up to patients or somebody else to have to be the one to do two things. She's there on the committee, or she's trying to advance her career, and at the same time, she's also having to provide the cultural intelligence to people. So some of this, I think, could be structural.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing I find interesting about this line of consideration extends patience, what you said and Minna said about the difficulty in finding good statistics and good metrics and good numbers. You know, I've seen some data that demonstrates coming out of the pandemic, especially women in leadership roles were more likely to leave the technology workforce. And I wonder if maybe this notion of the glass cliff is a part of the explanation for that. And so I think finding better statistics on retention in general globally, but then going a little bit deeper beneath the surface as to what those specific concerns are and issues are that are impacting some of these issues.
Maybe that's the topic for another book in the future.
That's right. It's a topic for another book in the future, which is a perfect segue into another question we're receiving in the chat, which is, do you intend a further volume of the handbook?
Well, I think, speaking of the future, maybe Jeria would be carrying this on. I'm retired, so I would not be. But I think Jeria, when you were talking about getting the statistics, and Manju brought this up, this whole world of remote work and work from home, and what the implications would be for career paths, is a very open question. I could see an argument in favor and an argument against. So I would think, revisiting some of these themes in a few years when we have some data could be a very interesting topic for another book, maybe.
So I think the answer is yes. Let's plan on that and make that happen. One of the attendees has asked if we could maybe talk through a few of the other questions that she raised relating to her own individual research. And Eileen, I think she's particularly interested in hearing ways in which we can effectively address and reduce the challenges faced by women in STEM fields. And then in addition, from a gender perspective, what ethical considerations should guide the evolution of IT?
How do we effectively reduce the challenges
faced by women in STEM fields?
Yeah.
So that's a very broad, complicated.
Well, it is. I think the FESTA project that Minna Salmonen talked about, and this project went on for 5 years, and so I was one of the people on the advisory board, and it was fascinating to see it. But they, as she showed in her slide, they really started from, the entry point and worked up through. And as the institutions discussed things that, they worked out a response. So I think, so people who are interested in taking kind of a comprehensive look, I would encourage you to look at her chapter and look at the FESTA website. Now, Minna is also retired, but not all of the people are. So, some of these, there are people in Ireland and Germany and Portugal who contributed chapters. And so I think they present kind of a comprehensive look at, conducting interventions. What was the other half? That was how to address ethical.
Yeah, before you respond to that, Eileen, if I could just add as well, at Carnegie Mellon, two things that have been really important and critical in addressing these challenges. First is leadership support. So regardless of the context, if it's an organization or an institution, an educational institution, having support and advocacy at all levels, but particularly at the leadership level, is essential. And then the second thing I would point to is a focus on culture and climate. and really trying to hone in on, what the environment looks like and finding ways to offer, a positive experience and looking for ways in which the majority is benefiting, building out mechanisms or even interventions to try and allow all to succeed and to have opportunities along those lines. The second part of the question was related to ethical considerations. So what ethical considerations should guide the evolution of IT?
That's a very, very large question. Something that we didn't get into it. It was just on, cusp of arising, its whole area of artificial intelligence. And I certainly think that's filled with ethical considerations, but yeah, that's a large one.
There's something I always talk about that more women need to design and develop technologies so they kind of look like us. And I think it's changing because I'm of the view that technology is neutral, but it's embedded in the philosophies, ideologies of the designers, developers. And as you know, would have noticed in previous eras, technologies, computers, even machineries, the dishwasher, all kinds of things had all these sharp edges. I know it's not like a very, intellectual academic kind of example, but it's like everything looked masculine. So as more women get into the industry, not just as users, but as designers and developers, you see things just, the devices having round edges and just kind of softer and all of that. So what does that say? I mean, does that enhance usability of these technologies? Not necessarily, but it's also, it's about representation and visibility as well. So the more women get into these industries, and this also applies to other groups, like, for instance, if a person with a certain disability gets to design and develop, that person would also be thinking about usability in, among the population of people with. So I know this has nothing to do with the ethical question, which is really broad, but I mean, the point is that the more people who use technologies get into the design and development spaces, the more technologies will be maybe more ethical, because it's definitely not neutral.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a very, very important point, that having diversity of representation isn't simply something that is a social good. It is a very practical good in terms of the technology that you're designing. And so if you don't have the representation, you're not going to get some of those insights. And whether we call it good or appropriate or ethical, I think that, the definition of ethical is very varied. But I think this notion, I think that was a good response to that.
All right.
How we doing?
On that wonderful note, I have to step away.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Prof.
you,
Thank you,
Patience.
Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Again, my apologies for all of that, but it's all good. All right. Okay. Bye.
Okay. Well, that does conclude all of the questions we've received in the Q&A. So I think we've answered those that were raised here. But like I said, this is not the end of the conversation, just the next step in the very long conversation. So for the attendees who are still here, don't hesitate to reach out and follow up with us or the other authors directly. And we really appreciate your attendance and engagement today. Any final words, Eileen?
No, thank you very much for participating. It's wonderful to share the results that we presented in the book, and I encourage people to take a look at the book to get it themselves or to have their libraries get it.
So with that, we're going to officially end the webinar. It will terminate the session. But again, thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement and conversation today.